The broadcast is now starting.
Hello everyone, happy Thursday, so good to see you, and welcome to another episode of the PixelMill Webinar Series and today's offering of tips from the SharePoint Framework Development Trenches. What a mouthful. As always, my name is Michael Wells. I'm the Partnerships and Community Manager here at PixelMill. And I actually want to start out by apologizing to you guys. I wasn't here last month. I always try to be here every month for you guys and have a little fun. And last month was a little bit crazy for me. I got to welcome my first son, my first child into the world. He's great. Mom is doing great. Everyone's doing pretty great. But that's why I wasn't here last time, so I apologize. I was going to show him at the beginning of this session today, but he, you give a baby a schedule and it gives you a baby middle finger. So he's napping currently, but anyway, I'm back now. I'm so excited for today's session. We have a great speaker and a great topic, and we'll get to that in just a minute. Really quickly, if you've joined us for a webinar before, this is your second, third, 15th webinar with us. Thank you so much for coming back. We always love having you here. Thank you so much. If this is your first time joining us, welcome. Thank you. Thank you for being here. We're happy to have you, and we hope to have you again a second, a third, a fourth, 15th time. And again, if you haven't been here before, a little bit about PixelMill. We specialize in building customized communication and collaboration solutions using things such as Office 365, SharePoint, Teams, and Azure. We're entering our 21st year of business, so we've been around for just a while, and now we can technically drink. But we've been a leader in enterprise UI, UX research, design, and development, just kind of in that space. So if you ever have any questions about that stuff, hit us up. We'd love to hear you. You can see all of our information on that title slide. If you have questions, comments, anything like that, you want to throw out an idea to our speaker or myself, there is a questions tab and a chat tab. Throw that stuff up there. I'll be keeping track of that stuff during the session, and we'll get those questions in as best as possible. We always try to leave a little bit of time at the end for a Q&A, so if we don't get to your question right in the moment, we will try to get to it at the end of the session. I think that's all. Enough about me, enough about babies, enough about other stuff. Let's get to our session. So our speaker today, he's a really amazing guy. If you were on our webinar series last month for our review of SBC&A, you saw him there. He's a pretty awesome guy, and you're going to love him too. Welcome, everyone. David Warner. Take it away, David.
All right. Thank you very much. Appreciate everybody showing up today. This is going to be a very collaborative session today, so feel free to ask questions. Sydney, I saw you said you won't have a zillion questions. If you do have a zillion, that's okay. We want this to be collaborative. So I got the chat window and the questions open on my other screen here. We're going to look to cover a lot of topics today. As was brought out, the title is Tips from the SharePoint Framework Development Trenches. And so we're going to move pretty rapidly across a lot of themes and topics. And so if we end up finding that we're lingering on one or the other, that's okay. There is no absolute set schedule that we have to spend on or get past for any particular slide or topic. If we end up lingering and you have questions, that's okay. I'll make sure the slide deck is available to PixelMill, so they'll be able to distribute it out to you guys at the end if you want to consume it, because there is a lot of links and information that you'll be able to hopefully benefit by. At least the goal is to give you one thing that maybe you didn't know about and that you can start using in your SharePoint framework development moving forward. So a little bit about myself as well as my partner in crime. He was unable to be here with us today, Bo Cameron. He's another MVP in the community, but him and I usually co-present this particular session together. We will be at a couple of SharePoint Saturdays coming up in September and October. So if you're near those locations, we'd love to have you come out and interact with us. I just want to make sure I gave him a shout out, and he got full credit for his investment in this particular session and all of the content that was put into it. So feel free to reach out to him, let him know, tweet, let him know you appreciated all the information as well. He's a good friend of mine, and I appreciate all that he does for the community as well. My name is, as you saw, David Warner, and this is my contact information. I do a lot of vlogging, video blogging, if you will, at my website, warner.digital, Microsoft MVP, work for Catapult Systems, and pretty active in the community as well on Twitter. So feel free to email me, reach out if you have any questions as well.
Hey, David.
So what's the agenda?
Hey, David, real quick. I'm still only seeing the very first opening slide. I don't know if you're...
Oh, you are? Okay.
Yeah.
Then let me back up here because you should be seeing more than that. Right, you should be now seeing Bo Cameron.
Yes, there we go.
Okay, all right, so it sounds like when it launched it didn't reshare the screen. So, all right, so here's Bo. Reach out to him. I already gave the dialogue on that, so feel free to let him know how much you appreciate the content. Here is my contact information as well. You can reach out to me at Twitter or my email, as well as my blog site there. Big sports fan, big SharePoint fan, as you can see behind me. Try to cross over that as much as possible. So feel free to reach out. So the agenda for today's session, we're going to talk about community engagement, how you can benefit by that. You don't have to necessarily contribute, but there's definitely a benefit for you to consume things that have been contributed by the community. So we're going to talk about where you might be able to benefit by interacting with those engagement opportunities. We're going to talk about SPFX tooling. So there's a lot of moving pieces when it comes to SharePoint Framework, whether you've started or you haven't started yet, looking to start, you might feel overwhelmed, might be a number of areas in which you kind of are not sure where to focus on. We'll talk about that as well. We're going to talk about the development overview of SharePoint Framework and some tips, power user tips. We'll go over some deployment tips and options, and then we'll also talk about how some debugging opportunities are available for you and management of your SharePoint Framework solutions are available to you there when you start doing that. You see that there's Parker there, Parky the Porcupine. He is the mascot for the PNP initiative. I have some stickers here as well. I'm happy to send out, so reach out to me on Twitter afterwards if you'd like one. I'll go ahead and get it to you. Vesa was kind enough to send me some, and so I'd be happy to distribute them out as well and pay it forward. All right, let's get it kicked off here. Patterns and practices. This is the community side of the SharePoint framework. Now, if you've not been engaged with this or exposed to it, definitely it behooves you to do so. In the first box there, you see that there is some community calls. You can go directly to that URL. Now, I call this the crystal ball to the future of SharePoint. These calls are open to the world. They are not invite only. They are taking the next month off, by the way, month of July, just so that it's a very global community. Summertime is a great time to spend with family, and so the next month of July will be taken off, but there is going to be another community collection of calls. Andrew Connell is heading that up, so go to that aka.ms/sppnp URL. All the information is there, but these are like really crystal ball glimpses into the future of SharePoint. You have the engineering team involved. You have demos coming out of community influencers and contributors like myself, like Bo, like many other people that are out there helping out in the community. And it gives you an idea of what's coming up next, what is on the roadmap. You get demos and samples of what is new and coming out soon. So it really helps you. There's a lot of moving pieces and it's moving very fast. These calls are an assist to you. They're really helping anyone and everyone keep up to date with what is the latest and greatest in the world of SharePoint Framework development, as well as general development. They have 2 themes every other week. It comes down to a call every week, and so the theme flip-flops from week to week. So it's not just SharePoint Framework, but as well as SharePoint General Development, which covers things like Power Apps, list formatting. And again, it's everybody's involved, and it's really a helpful way to stay up to date, ask questions, and get more involved. GitHub repositories here, github.com/PNP, github.com/SharePoint. These are Microsoft managed repositories in GitHub, but they are open to contributions from the whole world. So you get a lot of community contributors sending stuff up there, putting samples up there that you can then go take and essentially plug and play out to your tenant or your solutions. You can modify them. There is no licensing required for what you find there, and the gamut runs the full spectrum of opportunities. There's web parts, extensions, library components, list formatting definitions, documentation. Mark Anderson is working on that right now to provide a lot more documentation to general SharePoint usage. And so you can go there, you can contribute, or you can just consume, and there's a fantastic opportunity. On GitHub as well, there is an SP Dev Docs issues list. Now this is where all of the docs.com is now run by. It's actually engaged and ran by the GitHub repositories for DevDocs, specifically for SharePoint. Issues can be asked here. This is a great opportunity to go ask a question. If you're running into an error, you can reach out. The SharePoint engineering team is available there, and they will interact with you. You'll get other community contributors interacting, trying to help you if you have questions. It's also a great opportunity for you to contribute back in a very low-hanging fruit format. What I mean by that is you can actually submit, if you see a spelling, a better way to phrase something, maybe a grammar correction, you can actually submit without ever having to open a code editor. You can submit an update to the documentation, which then gives you actual full credit. Microsoft will give you credit by name in the monthly call, and you'll have you'll get full credit for that by name, which is pretty cool if you want to start getting more involved. And I will tell you this, I've been offering in Twitter I'll walk you through your very first one. It can be a little intimidating because what you're doing is exposed to the whole world, and you don't want to feel like maybe if I make a mistake, everyone's going to see it, and then I'm going to feel a little weird. Don't have to. I'll walk you through. I'll even find the first grammar correction or spelling update that needs to be made, and we'll do it together. So take advantage of that if you'd like to start getting involved. I've done that for a number in the community, and now I see them contributing left and right, and it's fantastic, and it's very collaborative. So take advantage of that. These are the three most popular ways that the Patterns Practices team can get you involved and you can get involved. So definitely take advantage of that as much as you can. Let's see, looks like there's a question on the support URL. Okay, sbdev-issues. Pretty much you can get to almost anything at aka.ms.sppnp. That'll link you out to things as well. All right, let's go ahead and move forward. Let's talk about tooling. Now, in the classic world of SharePoint, we oftentimes had to make decisions around what kind of tooling we were going to learn. We had content query web parts, right? And those used XSL. And I can't really ask for a show of hands of how many people liked XSL, but I'm going to guess that if all of you had the opportunity to raise your hand right now, almost none of you would choose to have embraced or liked XSL for content query web parts, but it was what we had. In fact, I remember interviewing someone and I said, how experienced are you with XSL? And the person said, oh, I use Microsoft Excel all the time. Don't even know what it is half the time. It's very limited, but it was what we have, right? It was what we have to use. Then we moved into content search web parts. You had display templates, which were, kind of JavaScript. You had JavaScript being written in commented out code, and so it could have been confusing, not quite sure how to work it. Now you move to SharePoint Framework, and you've got a much more formal collection of tools. And so now instead of having to know XSL or having to know display templates, all you have to learn is TypeScript, Gulp, Node, Yeoman, jQuery, VS Code, right? And you're like, oh my gosh, this is worse than it was before. I don't know where to start. Well, this is where we're going to help you today. Yeoman, Gulp, Node, VS Code, and any other framework or library such as Angular, React, jQuery, those are all secondary things. What you want to focus on, likely if you're new, is understanding TypeScript. TypeScript is the one area that you will be using the most when you start embracing SharePoint Framework. You likely could get away with 4 or 5 Gulp requests, maybe 1 Yeoman you might need to know, and Node just kind of does what it does in the background. You never really necessarily needing to interact with it heavily to do a lot of web part and extension development. So when you're working within that, the question is, what do you focus on? TypeScript, that's probably where you want to start at. You want to understand the architecture and how they work together. Microsoft is working on videos for that. They have fantastic documentation for that. But TypeScript is probably the one that you're going to want to get started with immediately and get to know and understand. Now, behind the scenes, what is TypeScript? It's strongly typed JavaScript, right? So you could go into your SharePoint Framework solutions and you could technically write with just pure plain vanilla JavaScript. TypeScript makes that better. It helps ensure that variables are defined for types so that when you try to use them later and it goes in and compiles or transpiles and packages your code for deployment, that you're not making a mistake that could have been caught early on. And so that's what TypeScripting, one of the few things, or many things I should say, that TypeScript helps you out with, is making sure that you're more tight-knit, written, well formatted before you even go deploy. JavaScript is very loose and allows you to make mistakes of ownership and stuff like that. All right, so how do you get started though? If you wanted to start working with SharePoint Framework, what's involved? You have a few different options. Now, I've written or done a few videos on Docker for SharePoint Framework development. This is kind of like a virtualization technology that allows you to run SharePoint Framework, Node, and Gulp, and Yeoman without ever actually installing it on your machine. Now, you could install Docker, and really that's the only thing you'd ever have to do. You have no local dependencies. You can switch between versions of SPFX and other open source tools, like what version of Node or Yeoman or Gulp or any other open source package that you may be using globally. You can switch between them pretty much instantaneously. And this makes it nice in when you want to test new versions of the SharePoint framework. If something new comes out, or you're upgrading a web part or solution to a new version of the SharePoint framework, and you need to test it against that or any other open source package, again, it's virtualization. And so you're able to isolate your global packages in that way. How does that look? Well, you've got your host OS, which in this case for me is Windows 10 Pro. It doesn't have to be Windows 10 though. You can run this on Mac OS or I believe Linux as well. And so you can see here it starts with your OS though. And then you install Docker, and then you're easily able to switch between versions, because what Docker does is it starts up a little mini VM. It's more complex than that. It's containers and images, but it allows you to kind of isolate your global node packages, especially if you're already doing any other development with other open source tools and you don't want those to kind of coexist on your same machine. It allows you to isolate those. Another option is NVM. I'm on Windows. NVM is not specifically just for Windows. In fact, it's a little more robust if you're not on Windows, and I'll kind of explain why in a moment. But it stands for Node Version Manager, and it allows you to switch between global installations of your node packages. So again, this is sort of like isolation, like Docker. It's not quite as isolated because node and your packages still do get installed on your machine. It's just that node version manager acts as the gateway between them, much like Docker did here, between the OS and your SharePoint Framework packages like Node and Yeoman and Gulp, etc. NVM kind of sits as that middle layer as well. So you can install multiple instances of Node. Within each instance of Node, you could have other global packages. So if you had a different version of different packages, then you can change them from each node version to node version. Now for non-Windows, if you're on a Mac OS, you actually have alias installs. So you can kind of name them something. So you could say SPFX 182 if you wanted to have a specific node version manager just for your versions of the different SPFX. Or you may have different clients that are using different versions of SPFX or different packages. Whatever the case may be, you may be doing development, you may be doing demos, you may be doing testing. The alias version within the Linux, I think Mac OS version is very powerful, very cool. And it really lets you isolate that. PNPM. Now, this is another way to sort of catalog locally your node modules. Now, if you're not familiar with node modules, it's like little packages of software that gets installed on your machine and that your SharePoint Framework web parts will utilize. It's pretty, not specific to SharePoint necessarily, it is just general web dev. But each time you install local modules, they're going to get pulled down and installed, and your node modules folder within your SharePoint Framework solution can get sort of big and bigger, and as you install different solutions, you get copies of node modules on your machine. PNPM allows you to kind of have a library that sits in a global location on your machine, and then instead of having to pull those down each and every single time you build a new solution, it kind of references those and pulls from that local cache, if you will, on your machine. Works with NVM or NVM for Windows if you're going to use that. They work fine together, so you can use them together. And SharePoint Framework fully supports it, so it just kind of keeps it cleaner, a lower footprint on your hard drive, and it's faster creation of new projects, because what might take 5 to 10 minutes to install all those node modules that SharePoint relies on, it pulls it from and or references it to your library cache of PNPM, and you may go to 1 to 2 minutes of installation time or setup time. So it's extremely powerful. All right, no other questions yet. The Yeoman Generator. Now this is a community-driven, you're gonna see a number of community-driven references to projects. Microsoft has its own Yeoman Generator that you use to scaffold out new web parts and extensions and solutions or library components. The Yeoman Generator is one that was kickstarted by Stefan Bauer, and it's a PNP initiative supported by Microsoft, so much so that it may very well become the Yeoman Generator for SharePoint, because behind the scenes, what's happening, even though it gives you access to all this additional stuff that you see on your screen, it's still using the out-of-the-box Yeoman Generator behind the scenes. So if you were to use the PNP Yeoman Generator as opposed to just the SharePoint Yeoman Generator that is documented within the installation and setup documentation, it still uses that behind the scenes and then builds on top of it. It's been so successful though, and powerful, and had such great contribution from the community that it likely may become the go-to Yeoman Generator for creating new SharePoint Framework solutions. and it's completely open source, so you can contribute to it if you would like as well. All right, looks like there's no questions so far. And again, I'm going to be moving pretty rapidly here from theme to theme and topic and slide to slide, so feel free to throw a question up there if you do have any, and we can linger if there is any questions. All right, so let's talk about the development overview for SharePoint. If you've not gotten into it, it might be beneficial to kind of know what it is that's needed, how it's made up, and what you'd be using. So solution options within SharePoint Framework, as you see here, the first bullet point is feature framework. You can use the SharePoint Framework to create things like lists, libraries, content types, site columns, that can actually be created as you go install your SharePoint Framework solution into a SharePoint tenant. So if you needed to create any of those for use with your web part or your extension or your solution or library component maybe, you have the opportunity to create those within your solution as an option. There are actually there's 3 additional. One I need to update here. Surprised I haven't, because I'm a big proponent of it, but you are able to create extensions with SharePoint Framework as well. So application customizers, think user custom actions from a classic environment, something that maybe is going to be applicable to your entire tenant or your entire site collection. If you needed to include a package or maybe some CSS that needs to apply globally or something like that, something that's going to put a header or maybe a global navigation or cross-site collection navigation to your tenant, application customizer would be the way to do that. Command set extensions. This is what gives you the ability to include menu options inside your list. If you wanted to include contextual menu options, like something doesn't happen until you select an item or you're in a specific list, and then someone selects an item in a list and you want to give them the opportunity to maybe do something to that item, invoke a button shows up. That's what command sets could be used for as well. Field customizers, think back to JS Link. So if you were to override the look and feel of a site column at a site column level or within a list in the classic world, you would have used JS Link. You can do the same almost stuff with Field Customizer. Right now, it only allows you to override the view experience. It doesn't quite support the editing experience yet. I know that's a big request in the community. So we'll see where Microsoft goes with that, but it still allows you to override what that field will look like when it's displayed within the list. And then of course, web parts. Web parts we all know what web parts are, little chunks of features that are interactive or display information, and those are what you can create with SharePoint Framework solutions. The other option that I don't have here is library components. Library components are very cool. I've done a lot of videos on them, so feel free to check out my website for some introductory videos on them. But they are the ability essentially to take feature functionality that you may need across multiple things. Let's say you're creating multiple extensions and web parts, and they all connect to some business-specific functionality that is unique to your company. If you were to include those in your web part or your extension, each and every single one of them is going to need to include that functionality. It's going to get bundled together, or you're going to need to reference it externally on a CDN. Library component allows you to put it into one SharePoint Framework solution, and then your web parts and your extensions can feed into that solution, that library component, to execute the functionality. That functionality could be something like Moment.js, jQuery, or a collection of SVGs. I just did a demo on that. There's a number of ways you can use it, and it only gets loaded once. So even if you have 4 or 5 web parts, pulling functionality out of that library component, it only gets loaded once on your page. Whereas if it was included in each of your web parts or extensions, it theoretically would have been duplicated on your page. And even though it was isolated to just the web part or the extension, it's still adding weight to your page, and therefore lowering potentially the performance of your site and your page. So library components are a way to kind of isolate functionality to one solution, but give it access to all these other components, such as web parts and extensions. It's very cool, and it's getting ready to go GA in 1.9. It is currently in preview. All right, any questions so far? Nope, okay. So SharePoint Framework development tips. All right, so how many are still using classic SharePoint? I am going to bet that most of us, as much as we love SharePoint Framework and we love the modern experience, we likely are still interacting with classic sites. And for me, I know most of the time, I'm not a workflow guy. So for many times it's workflow. But for me, when I'm interacting with a classic site, I'm having to go in and edit something like CSS or JavaScript or something like that, right? Maybe some files that when you go in and you access them with SharePoint Designer, I know who loves SharePoint Designer, right? Not very many people. But I do love the fact that I can access my files and it is a code editor and I can save and immediately see that reflected in the site. Now, some of the going directly to those files through the browser has improved in SharePoint, but I still don't know if I feel comfortable. I still don't love living within a browser to edit like JavaScript or CSS. So I do like being able to connect directly to SharePoint with SharePoint Designer, write my code and save, refresh the browser, and I see it reflected immediately. That is nice. Well, you don't even have to use SharePoint Designer for that anymore. You can use VS Code to replace SharePoint Designer if that is what you need. There is an extension called SPGo, and this allows you to connect to your modern and classic sites to access things like JavaScript, CSS, and any other type of file that you might otherwise use SharePoint Designer to connect to. And so I'm going to show you a demo of that because it's very cool, especially if you're having to perform this and you might be using SharePoint Designer for that function. So I've got Visual Studio Code open here, and I've gone to the extensions option here and just did a quick search on SPGo, so you can go install this if you would like. It is free. I did create a couple videos on it as well, so it'll show you how to use it there if you'd like to reference that at a later time as well. But I have a site here that I use for a couple of different SharePoint Saturdays called Secrets of the Fire Swamp. So it's my Fire Swamp site collection. And in it, I've got some CSS and JavaScript. And as I mentioned, I could technically now go into this site through the browser here, click on this JavaScript file, access it. It's much nicer than it used to be. It actually looks like a little code editor here, but I still don't necessarily love editing directly within the browser. Well, I can go into my VS Code and I can connect to that site and access all of my files that live there. So let's see how we would do that using SPGo. I've already installed it. I'm going to go ahead and invoke the command bar here. And I'm going to go ahead and do SPGo. And you can see there's a number of options here. We're going to start with configure workspace. Now, what it's going to do is it's going to pull those files down to my local machine. And I have a folder here called SPGo that I keep on my machine. And I name my folders here appropriate to my tenant and site name. So for example, I can keep these pretty readily available for myself. And I've got popwarner.fireswamp. Popwarner is the name of my tenant in SharePoint. Fireswamp is the particular site we're going to use today, but I've got other sites that I use to access. And so this is an easy way to kind of access clients, my own, keep them organized. And so inside of Fireswamp, we're going to go, and I've already got a configuration file for SPGo. I've just called it .prod because I want to copy some content out of it to show you, and it's just easier to copy and paste than to retype it. But I'm going to show you how to do it from beginning to end. So I'm going to go back in here and I'm going to say configure workspace. You can see it's there in my recently used because I'm just making sure everything's working. And then it's going to ask me, well, what's the SharePoint site URL that you want to connect to? So I go ahead and give it my URL, and it asks me, how do you want to, or what do you want to happen when you save? So you've got a few options here. Save and keep editing, which means save the file to the server, but don't publish. Publish, create a minor version, do nothing. I'm going to go ahead and click save and keep editing. And then how do you want to authenticate? And so in this case, for Office 365, I'm going to go ahead and use digest. And now what's happened is you can see it's created an spgo.json file here for me. And it's interesting, it's actually already populated what was there, which is interesting. It usually is devoid of remote folders. So it could be an update to that occurred. But this is usually what you get when you create a brand new SPGo configuration. And what you need to do is you need to add to it. I know I've been in contact with the creator of this, so he may have updated it. You have to add what remote folders that you want it to pull down, because if you don't tell it what folders or file types you want to pull down, then it will actually go ahead and pull down nothing. So you have to be verbose with what it is. So in this case, I've got my files stored at style library, image gallery, and I'm using wildcards. As you can see here, I want to pull down the two files, CSS and JS. So I'm going to go ahead and save that. And then I'm going to go up and we'll invoke our command bar, and I'm going to say populate local workspace. Now what it's going to do is it's going to authenticate or try to authenticate, and it should be asking me for that. And it's not. It might be because I need to restart it. So let's go ahead and do that. Go back over the code. I may have needed to close it first since I was playing with it earlier. We'll re-invoke that, populate local workspace. All right, activating extensions. And we can see it's working on something. So we'll say that again. There we go. Okay. So I just needed to reset it because I was authenticated earlier. So now it's asking me for my username. So I'm just going to go ahead and say david@popwarner.onmicrosoft.com, and it's going to ask for my password. So I'm going to go ahead and authenticate there. And what you're going to see over here is it's populating the workspace. You can see that down here in the lower left. And once it populates the workspace, it's going to show me my source files here. It's a little slow today. Could be SharePoint Online is a little slow. And it's going to show me my source files here once it finishes. It's a little slow today, and I promise you it does work. Now it's going to show me my source files. Once it does show, the cool thing to remember is that the source files that it pulls down aren't actually being connected directly to the files on the server, meaning that if I were to delete them from my local workspace here, they would not delete them on the server. I can make modifications, and it's definitely a little slow today, so I'm wondering if maybe I fat-fingered my ID password, so we'll retry that again. While you save and edit, and you are able to see those updates, and we will see that happen, go ahead and let that go. When we save and edit, it will go ahead and make those changes. Activating extensions. Make that request again. All right, David. Oops. All right, so it should be pulling it down as we go enabled. And it should be pulling it down locally. Demo gods are not with me today. They were with me earlier. This worked perfectly earlier. We'll let that go. But what'll happen is it should be pulling down all those files. It's going to create an SRC folder here. We're able to access them and then open them. And when we do that, we're able to make changes. And once it does happen, I'm able to make changes, and then we'll see it reflected here within the browser. So I could actually go in and uncomment out my alert here, and we'll see it work. And I'm not quite sure why this was working perfectly earlier, so I apologize. We can come back to it later. But the point is, while this wasn't the most successful demo, it is a very powerful tool. It allows you to access your files. I use it all the time. I'm not quite sure why it's failing right now, so I apologize for that. But it is a very powerful tool and allows you to edit and access, and you no longer have to use Visuals or a SharePoint Designer if you don't want. So we'll come back to this. It could be something's kind of going crazy with it right now, but it worked perfectly earlier. I was able to pull down my source files and edit them and save them, and everything worked perfectly. So I apologize for that. But take a look because it is very powerful. And the nice thing you get, obviously, and I'll just kind of show you here in a new file, is if you ever go into SharePoint Designer and you even try to do something as simple as console.log, it won't even recognize that, right? Here you get true IntelliSense, which is extremely powerful for you.
Hey, David, we had a question pop up. Finally, got a question for you. Can you copy and paste or upload files using SPGo?
Yeah, I believe actually if you do add, I mean, you can, when you say copy and paste, I'm not sure if the question is copy and paste code in. When it does populate the workspace, it will just simply be a true JS file that's downloaded. So when you open that JS file, like if I was to come here and say new file and do js.js, right? And I were to open that, it will just see it as just as regular JavaScript. And so you can see here that I've got access to all my JavaScript information. So you can copy and paste the code in if that's what you mean. If you mean copy and paste in a file and you do an update, I believe it will upload the file for you. And when you delete the file, it doesn't delete it off the server. So what should be happening here is it should populate a source folder here. It would create a source folder and then it would show me these files here within SharePoint. It'll show me my image gallery, CSS, and JS. And if I were to delete them from the actual location here inside of SPGo, inside of my popwarner.fireswamp folder, then it would only delete them here locally. And so I'm even going to actually try that again. I'm going to just try to do, if we can just delete this from the beginning, I'm going to close this guy and we are going to come in here. The code will give it one last try before we move on because it is a very powerful, very cool and tool. We'll close this guy, close him, and we will go ahead and invoke a configure workspace. And we'll go back and grab the URL just in case it doesn't already have it. And it's definitely running a little slow today, so there we go. So let's give it that. I will say save and keep editing, digest. All right, now it's actually done a little better. So I'm going to copy out my configuration here, and we'll go ahead and paste it, see if this gives us a little more success. I'm going to save that, and then I'm going to say populate workspace, and it's much quicker now. So I'm going to say David at pop. All right, let's see if this was the charm. And apparently it wasn't. So I apologize for that. But go use it, install it, give it a try. Check out my videos. It does work very much. Again, it was just working perfectly this morning, so I may have some strange oddity going on. Maybe I fat-fingered my connection again. But it does populate it down, and it is very powerful. So definitely go check that out. All right. So minimal path to awesome when you're doing development. We had talked about how much you need to know about gulp and installing and all of that. Technically, you could get away if you were to go download samples from the SharePoint Framework repositories in GitHub. These are the 4 commands you would probably need to know the most. You're going to do an npm I, that's an I there, or install. And then when you're done developing, you're going to do a gulp clean, gulp bundle, gulp package, -- ship to give you the ability to go deploy these files. All right, development. Now, when you're going in and developing web parts or extensions, you want to be able to inherit the theme colors. In SharePoint Online for Modern Experience, they've done amazing work in conjunction with the Office UI Fabric. So you get absolutely powerful inheritance of theme colors. The setting up a theme within the Modern Experience now is very, very easy to do. And as a developer, you can inherit those theme colors. So in this particular example, you can see that I've got a red theme on the left for this particular site, fashion events. And then on the right, I've got IT department, and it's using a blue theme. Down here on the bottom, though, is the exact same web part. And you can see that I've set it up to inherit the theme colors of my site. So you definitely want to do that yourself as well. You would not want to, or nor need to now, hard code colors unless it's a very verbose or specific reason that you need to. Maybe it's some sort of regulation or something that you need. But you can set it up to inherit, because you could imagine if I was on a site that was predominantly blue and I was forcing this reddish orangish color, it may not fit, it may stick out like a sore thumb. So you definitely want to make sure that you set up your web parts to inherit that is fully available to you. There's documentation on how to do it. And you can see here that it looks like this. And I know that might be hard to see, so I will zoom in there a little bit. And you can see that you identify the theme primary. And so when you go create your theme, you're able to identify exactly which of the theme. You've got multiple slots for your theme colors, and you see that when you set it up, and then you can set up a default background color, or a backup color, I should say, that you can fall back to. All right, don't see any other questions. So definitely set up your theme colors when you're creating your web parts. Another benefit for you when you're doing development is don't reinvent the wheel. Property pane controls. Now, if you're new to SharePoint Framework or Modern Experience Development, you may say, well, what do you mean by property pane controls? In SharePoint Classic, we had no access to that unless you rolled your own web part, which you can't do in SharePoint Online using .NET. Now in SharePoint Framework, one of the coolest things is you can create your own configuration panel for your web parts. And so there may be a desire to create very interactive controls for that configuration. No need for you to have to do that all from scratch. The PNP team and community has property pane controls that you can access, as well as React components. And again, this slide deck has these URLs in it, so when you get your hands on it, you can go to them, but they are at the GitHub repository for SharePoint. So definitely look into utilizing these. A lot of the community has contributed to them. You can see it's got things like charting and auto completion and drop down and availability for you to utilize to make your development a little bit easier. PNP.js, this is one of my favorites. I encourage everyone to use this. If you've ever been making connections or requests to SharePoint lists or libraries using the REST API, you know that can get somewhat verbose and frustrating, and you have to deal with all kinds of the responses and the promises and all that. PNP.js, among many other things that it does, simplifies that for you. It's kind of like jQuery for SharePoint, right? jQuery was great. While it's heavy-handed, it shortcuts a lot of things that JavaScript may be more verbose to do vanilla-like. And so it has IntelliSense. It simplifies the development experience. You can see here that you're simply able to make a connection to lists by title by simply doing sp.web.list.getByTitle. You give the name .items.select, and you can see how clean the requests can be made to get back. And then when you get it, you get, you top 50 if you say get then, and you define what you want to happen. So it makes it much easier to interact with those REST APIs that are in SharePoint. It provides easier to read code. It also has built-in caching, which is super, super cool, because if your list data is not going to really be changing that often, then you might not need to go send every user to it every single time they load a page. And so now you can set it up to use either session storage or local storage using PNP.js. It's currently working on 2.0, and there's opportunity for you to contribute there if you'd like. Feel free to reach out to me or go to pnp.github.io pnp.js, and you'll find a dev-v2 section that you can learn more about. But PNP.js, one of the coolest things coming out of the PNP community that enables you to be a better developer and do more faster. The Office 365 CLI command line interface. If you've not interfaced with this, definitely take a look. And one of the coolest things is that it is platform independent. And so whether you're on Mac, Linux, Windows, you're able to use it, which can't be said for PowerShell. As much as I love PowerShell, if you're not on Windows, you're kind of left out of the game, right? So with the CLI, it gives you access to not only your SharePoint site, being able to control that, but your Office 365 tenant. You can do things through a command line interface to your entire Office 365 tenant. It is compatible with Docker, and you're actually, Waldeck had done who's kind of the grandfather of Docker with SPFX, if you will, had done a sample lately that shows how to get it working within a web part in the site. It's like CLI Inception. It's super cool. But one of the other things that it does that I don't think anything else can do is it can help you upgrade your solutions. So what happens is when you engage with a CLI, you can point it at, say, for example, a SharePoint Framework web part that you built using the framework 1.6. You want to upgrade that to 1.8.2, the newest version of the SharePoint Framework. Without the CLI, you're left kind of having to go back through all the release notes and filter through everything and identify what exactly it is that you need to do to get your solution updated to 1.8.2. If you use the CLI though, it provides those instructions for you. You can use what's called the project upgrade command, and it will analyze, and it won't make the changes for you unless you copy out the code that's included in the report, but it'll analyze your solution, provide you a report that says all of the things that you need to do to get your web part or extension or solution updated to whatever version it is that you requested. And I say you requested because you could tell it, well, I'm at 1.6, I don't quite want to go to 1.8, I only want to go to 1.7 for maybe whatever reason. You can tell it that too, and it'll provide you the report that shows you all the things that you need to do to get it upgraded. It even includes not just the instructions, but it'll give you a summary of the scripts and the installations that you need to run. So you could almost just copy and paste out of the report what you need to do to give to your SharePoint solution to get it upgraded. So if you've used it or not used it, definitely take a look at the SPFX upgrades, the project upgrade. That is by far one of the coolest things, and it is just amazing if you're ever having to do any kind of upgrades. So it's very, very powerful. All right, no other questions. Environment variables. So you can use environment variables within your solution to determine where your solution is running. So if you needed to do something specific, if any one of these scenarios were in play, we're in Classic, we're loading mock data, we're running from our local workbench, we're running within SharePoint, you can actually use these environment variables to adjust how your code is going to react based on where you're testing it, which is useful for development. You may not necessarily want to leave it in there for production case because you're going to not necessarily need a local workbench, for example, if you're dealing with it, but it is a great development opportunity. Maintenance mode. If you're working within a web part on a page and you wanted to learn a little bit more about what is going on behind the scenes on your web part, you can use this argument on your URL command line to tell you more about your web part. You can see there the web part bundle, where the web part bundle is hosted, external scripts, the version of the framework it was built on, and some more information. So definitely utilize this. Sometimes when we put SharePoint Framework web parts up into our tenant, it may seem like I don't have a lot of access to it, don't quite know how to understand anything behind the scenes, the developer console is not telling me what I need, and so there are definitely ways that you can access the information. When you are developing your web part, we had talked about how everything gets bundled into a single file. So all of your imports, such as like jQuery or Moment or PNP, if you're not using library components, are going to get bundled and encapsulated into your solution files, right? Whether it's a web part or whether as an extension. You can dynamically bundle them using TypeScript, which is super, super cool. So you see here, in the particular example here, I have bundled a web part, and I think in this particular example, it's loading something like jQuery, and you can see that file size is 100 KB for my web part. Now, I may not be using jQuery unless something is clicked on or some execution occurs via an interaction with the user. Even though I may not be using it until some point in the future, it's still going to get bundled. My web part gets loaded, that JS is going to load on the page. And if you propagate that across multiple solutions, you could see the performance impact. It's going to lower the performance of your solution for an unnecessary reason. But if you dynamically bundle, you can see that it will split your bundles up into multiple pieces. So in this case, I've bundled my jQuery, I think it was, into a separate file. And now instead of being one big 100K file, I've got an immediate 14K file right here. And that's what's going to get loaded. And then these other pieces of functionality are going to get called in asynchronously. And so instead of loading those at load time of the page, they only get loaded in when they're actually needed. And so if I don't need jQuery, or the user doesn't actually invoke any event that requires it, or whatever may be behind that particular piece of functionality, it doesn't get loaded on the page, only at the necessary time when it's being requested. So definitely a lot of power here. There is a few samples up in the GitHub repository. This is one that shows how to do it specifically within a web part. So definitely take advantage of that. It's a super useful technique, and it can also be used for CSS, by the way. So you could dynamically load CSS and bundle dynamically your CSS into multiple files as well. All right, no other questions yet. Power user tips. You may not be the biggest fan of development. You may not necessarily want to be using everything you can get your hands on around SharePoint Framework. So what can you do? Let's talk about list formatting. I'm a huge fan of list formatting. It is extremely powerful. This, while it has development-esque feelings to it, if you develop the actual definitions for list formatting, you're going to write them in JSON. You're not actually needing to compile anything. So you don't actually have to compile or bundle or package and go install anything. You're able to make changes to your list data without ever having to actually go install any of those apps. So it can control the formatting of your content, your column content or your view. And so you may see something here like this. This community members has names in the title column, and then it's got the Twitter account in the Twitter column. You can change the way it looks with column formatting. So in this case, I've overridden the Twitter column with a column formatting definition. And what it's doing is it's doing a couple things. It's actually going out to Twitter, grabbing the profile picture of these Twitter accounts and pulling it back in for display. But it's also making that little round circle avatar or profile picture clickable. So now instead of just being a name, I can actually click on it, and not only does it display a better value or content for this user, a little more, we're visual creatures, and so sometimes we are more aware of things like pictures. It's actually functional instead of just being informational. View formatting, that takes it to a whole new level. So instead of just changing a particular row, in this case, I'm actually, or a column, I should say, in this case, I'm overwriting the entire row for the list item. So I'm able to identify and pull in the data from Twitter, as we see here, the avatar. I was able to create a little button here. And then I'm actually connecting out to the Google Map API. And based on their location that I also have in my list, it's pulling back a little view of where they're from. So Chris is in Indiana, Bo is in Colorado, Seb is up in Montreal, so it kind of just shows Canada and shows half the world where him, and I think I see Auntie out there, and Canada's a big space, so it shows more of the map. But it pulls that in live, and so if I were to go in there and add myself or anybody else and put Los Angeles or some other area, it's going to show it. So you have a much more engaging opportunity to display your list content in a way that is more consumable and enjoyable. This content and this formatting does extend over into the web part. They're still working on kind of perfecting that way that this list formatting does get displayed in the web part when you drop it on a page, but they will get there. Microsoft will absolutely get there. And that is super, super powerful and super cool, because now you can take all this information that lives on your list, and because even, for example, it is in a view, you can have multiple views on your list, and each view can have its own definition. So you could have a view like this, a community members with maps. You could have another view that shows some other way of visualizing this data. And you can put that into a web part on a page, and you almost have a custom web part that didn't require any transpilation, packaging, installing of apps, or anything like that. And there is a huge repository there for all of us to have access to for column and view formatting definitions that we could just go copy and paste. And you don't have to pay for anything. It's all completely free, and you can ask questions. So definitely take advantage of this if you haven't been exposed to this part of the modern experience yet. All right, deployment options. So once you've built your SharePoint Framework solution, what options do you have to get it out to your sites? The first one is the tenant app catalog. So this is where you're going to go ahead and put your solutions that are going to be available to your entire tenant. If you want all of your site collections to have access to these then you would put them there. It's managed by your tenant administrators. It's tenant scope deployment. You can auto activate them and stuff like that. But let's say, for example, maybe you own your own site, or maybe you're doing development and you want to isolate some of your dev test and all of that. You only have one tenant. You can create and utilize the site collection app catalog. So this is managed by local site collection administrators. It's scoped to that site collection. So if you go and install like a web part or an extension in your site collection app catalog, it's not going to be available to everybody else. It's only that singular site collection. So it's perfect for development in a single site collection where you may not want to override something at the tenant level, or you may not want to expose your web part or your extension to the entire organization before it's really ready. It allows you to scope it just to that site collection. You also have provisioning options with site designs. So site designs allow you to pre-install some things. For example, SharePoint Framework extensions and web parts, you can pre-install them on your sites using site design. That is another provisioning option.
And hey, we had a question come in, David. Let me throw it your way real quick. It's from our friend Eric. Thank you, Eric, for throwing this question in. Does this work for Office 365 group sites as well?
This being the site collection app catalog? Is that the, so feel free to type that in the chat or a new question.
He says yes.
Yep, okay. Yep, perfect. So I believe so, yeah. I mean, a site's a site, right? Now you have to create it. You have to create it typically through PowerShell. So it's not like an interface thing where you're gonna go and just set up a site collection app catalog. You do have to go kind of invoke it through PowerShell, or at least that's how I've done. I don't believe there's any configuration interface for that. I believe, let's see, I believe that would be the same.
Sorry, there's also a follow-up about on-prem as well. I just wanted to throw that out there.
Yep, same question for on-prem. I'm not sure on that. I'd have to check on that. I think so. Where the app catalog exists, I think 2019 you would be able to invoke that there. When they created 2019, it was essentially kind of like a fork of a SharePoint Online version at some moment in time. And so, yeah, I believe that is possible. And then extension, same question for on-prem, extension for branding. Yeah, I think if what you mean is, can you invoke that using an extension for branding? I believe so, yeah. But I could double check for you. I don't do a lot of on-prem, to be honest with you, just by way of the nature of the cloud growth. But I think you can, so I'll double check on that for you. Any other questions?
I think that was it for that. Oh, I think I lied. One more. Are they still going to have feature packs to upgrade on-prem to cloud? Yeah,
so I don't think you're going to see a huge degree of bringing it forward, if you will. The challenge with a lot of the new features coming out in the cloud is that they're cloud connected to other services. And there's not necessarily a way to enforce that or guarantee that availability to the on-prem. And so I don't necessarily think you're going to see, I think they're listening, and the more people make noise about it, they're going to try to find things that can get added to on-prem through like a feature pack. But I don't think you're going to, at some point, like you're going to get an feature pack 1 that's going to bring it forward completely to everything that's available to online. I think if there is enough request for it, and I'll explain what I mean by that in a moment, if there's enough request for any particular thing that can be deployed to on-prem, then they may deploy and offer that one particular thing. And what I mean by request is out at user voice, sharepoint.uservoice.com, you are able to suggest, and I'll bring this up here in a browser, you're able to come out and make recommendations and suggestions, right? So if you have something specific on a particular topic, and we'll just go to the dev platform because that's kind of where I live, you can see that there is a lot of opportunity to create a new idea. You can search for one that may already be here that meets your needs, and then you can vote on it. Or you can create a new one if there's not one already there, and you have a specific thing that you need in on-prem, excuse me, that you would like to see happen. I think that Microsoft is kind of holding the line that you're not going to see a lot of things moved into the middle until you get another version of on-prem. But I think if there's enough support, I think they're starting to listen, and they do listen. There's a lot of things in user voice that has gotten created and been done. So please don't ever think that it's just going on deaf ears. I know for a fact that there is a lot of eyes on this every week by the engineering team to look at and triage and go through this information. So don't feel like you don't have a voice at all. You absolutely do. And so definitely take advantage of that and use that that platform to make some requests. Hope that answered your question. All right, we are just about running out of time, so let me start moving through some of these a little faster. Debugging. This is one thing I wanted to point out that is very powerful. When you go deploy your SharePoint Framework solution into your site, whether it be a web part or an extension, you may think, well, how, everything's encapsulated into this tiled and web-packed JavaScript. How do I get access to that? It's not like it's a file that I can just go start adding console logging information to. No, you can't. But using this query string command right here on your URL, you are able to then point it back to your local machine as if you were deving. So something is deployed, living in SharePoint, you're able to put that at the end of the page where it lives. And now instead of going to look at the app catalog for those files, as long as you're serving up the solution from your local machine, it will point back to your machine only for your session in that browser, and function, everything will function from that JavaScript file or from that solution. And so you're now able to do alerts and console logging and debugging with something that's in production without disturbing anybody else or them seeing what it is that you're working on behind the curtain, so to speak. You're the wizard behind the curtain and no one sees you. So extremely powerful. Use this anywhere and everywhere you can when you're needing to debug. It saved me a million times when something was very specific or isolated to a tenant or a user or something like that. It's very powerful. Bo here has a blog post. Again, the URL will be included here in the slide deck, but you can find where your SPFX web parts are in the tenant using search, which is extremely cool. So if you have that need, definitely go check that out. Application Insights is another tool that you can use that helps you kind of track a number of things in addition to just usage by users, when they're using, how much they're using, what they're using the most, but it can also be used for tracking exceptions and errors, page views, AJAX calls, custom events and metrics. And so it's very powerful. It's built into Azure and you can utilize that. So definitely look into that as well. I think we are just on a couple minutes after the hour. So I know there was some time we want to leave for Q&A. So thank you. Reach out to
take your time. If you got more to talk about, go ahead.
Okay, no, we actually hit the end there, so we're actually doing pretty good.
Oh, there you go.
Here's the contact information for myself and Bo. Again, Bo's awesome, so feel free to send a tweet out to thank him for his contributions on this as well. We try to do it together as much as possible. And thank you for joining us today.
There you go. Well, thank you, David. What a great session. That was. We always like doing these kind of sessions, kind of hear the latest and greatest of all that stuff going on. And thank you so much. That was wonderful, guys.
Yeah, and sorry about that one demo snafu, I guess, with SVGo. Go check out my website. There's videos that actually show exactly how it works. It's I can't underscore enough how cool and useful it is.
We'll probably never invite you back, but it's
understandable.
I get it. All right. Yeah, guys, there's a lot of good stuff on here. So we'll definitely try to get the recording of this up as soon as possible. Should have that up to you guys by early next week. That's what I usually try to get going. Again, if you guys have any follow-up questions, any of this, throw them up in that questions tab. David, where can we see you coming up? You speak a lot. You do a lot of you live that conference life. Where can we see you coming up soon?
Yeah, so I will be in New York here at the end of July. If anybody is near that area, definitely the collection of speakers that go to New York is, man, it's amazing. There is just, I'm in awe of the brain power that shows up at that event. Tom Daly runs that, who is a good friend of mine as well, and he does an amazing job.
I believe Tom Daly's on our webinar today, so shout out to Tom Daly. Thanks for being here, Tom.
Yep. Yeah, I see him. There you go. Yep, cool. So he actually is part of this particular session as well. So I think him and I and Bo will probably be presenting on a future one here. I know I'd submitted to a few different ones, so none of those are done until they're done. but hopefully there'll be some coming up. We do have SPS LA coming up in SharePoint or September. So go check out the SPS events if you're near LA. It's a fantastic event at the Microsoft campus there in LA down by the beach. So anybody who likes to be near the water, definitely check that out. That's going to be a great event. So definitely try to come out there. We're looking for speakers. It's still open for speakers and sponsors and just registered attendees. So definitely go check that out. I think you're muted.
I was so muted. There you go. If anybody's playing along with webinar bingo, you just checked off someone who was speaking was muted. So we had a couple of questions come in while you were talking, David. So we'll start with our first question. Came in from our friend Alex. Alex, thanks for throwing up this question. When using Docker, are NVM, PM, Yeoman, etc., installed on the Docker image or on the PC?
Yeah. Okay. So a few different things in there. I probably wouldn't use NVM and Docker together necessarily. Those kind of fill the same need. So I would probably use one or the other. I use both. I personally have been using more NVM lately just because I like the experience it provides and I can do a lot of things in parallel with one another. But as far as PNPM, Yeoman, so Yeoman Gulp, the SharePoint generator, those are typically are things that are installed in the image. So you create an image, which is a read-only entity, and then you start what's called a container on that image. And that container connects to those things that live in the image. It's like a read-only VM, if you will. And then the container points to a location on your hard drive. And that's where all of your local node modules will get installed, your files will get installed, and then you can still submit them into GitHub or whatever your version control system is. So it's kind of both, right? So the things that need to be installed globally live in Docker. Your solution files still live on your PC, and that's really where you want them because you want to be able to submit them up to your code repository and stuff like that. So hopefully that answers your question. Does the deployment of SPFX components impact general upgrades on the Office 365 platform? I know if sites have certain customization, they are skipped for platform upgrades. I think that's more of a classic mentality personally. I would say no, because the architecture of deploying SharePoint Framework solutions is much more organized now. So whereas in classic, where you could make modifications, so I think what you're alluding to here is like a master page. You go change the master page in classic, and they're going to skip maybe any modifications or improvements to the out-of-the-box master page because they don't know what all you've done in your master page. You don't really have to worry about that anymore with with modern, because things are much more organized and architected in a isolated and modular way. So your SharePoint Framework web part, when you bundle it, it's doing what's called web packing. And the reason why things like I had mentioned JavaScript or jQuery or PNP.js or Moment.js or something gets bundled in is because then it's encapsulated and it's only accessible by your code. So what's cool is it makes sure that something from this web part's not going to affect something from this web part, unless maybe you're calling it in globally and loading in jQuery globally, which you shouldn't do. So things are much more encapsulated. You're given less overall control. Now, where you could get into trouble there is if you were to write CSS that's going to modify something like the suite bar, or you're overriding some area of SharePoint that Microsoft has really recommended you can't, right? There's much more territorialism now. And I don't mean that in a bad way. I just mean they've given us access to areas where they've said, this is your area, like extensions. When you go create, for example, Tom has a great session on creating a site collection or cross-site collection mega menu. And so you inject that into the placeholder via the extension, and Microsoft said, look, that's your space. We're not going to modify that. You do what you want there, and we won't touch anything that's going to break that. But when it comes into other areas of the site, like maybe the page layout, so to speak, or the page design, if you will, where those sections are now, they're not really zones anymore, they're sections within the modern experience. If we try to override the CSS there or change the header in some way, while we have full control and are able to do that using our CSS, there's no guarantees that a change they make is not going to break that. So when you're doing things in the recommended way, the recommended Microsoft way, you're building your web parts to own your web part, you're building your extension to own your extension, you're safe. You shouldn't really be bamboozled across the head in any way, right, by Microsoft with future changes. But if you go outside that scope and you start making modifications to things that we don't own as developers, you take that risk. Now, it doesn't mean that people don't do that, and it doesn't mean that you can't do that. It just means you got to understand the risk you're taking. Sometimes the better way is to make noise around what it is you need. User voice, a great way to do that. You need something, go start making noise and try to get support for that. The more support you get for that Microsoft sees as they go through and review those entries, the more likely you're going to get what you want in a supported, sanctioned way. So hopefully that makes sense.
Awesome. And this next question is actually more so for me, from our friend Joseph. Joseph, Thanks for asking about this. Hey, PixelMill, what about SharePoint Saturday in Northern California, Sacramento, or Silicon Valley? That's an excellent question, sir. And if Eric Overfield were on this call, he'd have more to say about it. But we're working on that. It's something we're working on. Our focus is kind of shifted here at PixelMill, kind of shifted away from that for just a little bit, but we're coming back to that now. A couple other outside forces, things we'd kind of deal with, but keep an eye out for that stuff. There will be more information about that coming soon. I wish I had more to say about it, but we are excited that those are going to be coming back very soon. So definitely keep an eye out for that. And then looks like Eric's thanking you for your explanations. Well done, David. Good job.
Thank you.
All right. If there are no other questions, I'll start some of the wrap-up stuff. Guys, thank you so much for being here today. Thank you, David, for an amazing session. Like I said, this is the type of session we love having in our series a couple times a year, just to talk about what's new, what's going on. This kind of dev stuff is really at the heart of what we do and what Eric and I love to talk about. So thank you so much for adding into that. Next month, guys, in the month of, what's next month? July. There we go. We're going to have our good old friend Ryan Scouten coming back to do our next session. I believe he's doing a session on stream. Still kind of waiting to get the final information on that, but that'll be coming out to you soon. So that'll be that for next month. Then we've got some other great things planned for the rest of the year that I can't wait to tell you about. We'll tell you about at some other time. But yeah, all right. If there are no questions, guys, let's wrap it up. Thank you so much for spending your Thursday early afternoon with us. Always love having you guys here. David, thank you again. And we will see you guys next time around the road. Have a great day.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for your time.
I guess.